Lot 104 is quite interesting. The stiletto that Georges Sand used to wear on her belt. Bidding begins at 1,000 euros.
I have 1,000. I have 1,700. I have 1,900. Going in 1,900.
1900, j'adjuge.
Sold in 1,900.
1900 au téléphone.
No one has been more of a dreamer and less of a doer in life than I. But what would you expect of a novelist? Listen, here's the story of my life.
Maiden name, Aurore Dupin de Francueil. Born in Paris on July 1st, 1804. Delights in drawing caricatures of herself. Still a child when her father dies, she is torn from her mother and brought up by her paternal grandmother, the descendant of a Polish king. She receives a liberal upbringing. Very liberal.
I prefer one nettle of my countryside to an oak in any other land. My heart jumps for joy with every stone, every bush I recognize.
Her countryside is the region of Le Berry, and early on she causes her first small scandal there when she dares to dress like a boy to go horseback riding. She, the granddaughter of such a noble aristocrat, the proprietor of the Chateau de Nohant.
I suspect all my biographers of being terribly aristocratic, since they endow me with such illustrious origins, but fail to mention the very obvious stain on my lineage. My mother was born to a poor family. Her father sold canaries and finches on Quai des Oiseaux.
This wasn't merely the house of Georges Sand's childhood memories. It was very important to her. It was the source of all solace. At the most painful times of her life, when she lost her grandchildren, or suffered from a broken heart, or when the political scene took what she thought was a disastrous turn, she always came back here.
And in time, strange beings would occupy the house.
Ce bain de stick, c'était délicieux. Je me suis presque plus enrhumé du cerveau.
But well before the arrival of those characters, Aurore, somewhat too fast, marries the Baron Casimir Dudevant. She has 2 children. The young bride is the head of the household, but her husband manages all the affairs. Aurore soon reacts against this injustice and against the boredom of it all. She eagerly explores new paths and socializes with the turbulent young Republicans of the region, one of whom is Jules Sandeau. But in 1830, the Republicans in Paris take to the streets. Aurore is enthusiastic about the revolution. She soon leaves her husband, moves to the capital, and enjoys strolling along the Seine. With Jules Sandeau, her young lover, she co-writes a novel, mysteriously signed J. Sand. Before achieving renown as George Sand, all of Paris acclaims her. One day in June 1832, Sand is out walking with her 5-year-old daughter, Solange, when Louis-Philippe's troops charge against the Republican insurgents. She manages to return safely to her 3-room flat on the Quai Saint-Michel.
15 insurgents were massacred and thrown into the river. 2 others were caught in the nearby streets and had their throats cut. I did not see this atrocious scene, concealed by the dark of night. But I heard the furious clamor and abominable cries. Then a deadly silence descended upon the slumbering city. I am so disgusted with life that only my children make it bearable.
George Sand begins writing as a journalist for the satirical press. Her pieces are a scandal. By attacking the government of Louis-Philippe in her numerous articles in Le Figaro, she causes the newspaper to be closed down.
Mais le vrai début de George Sand.
However, George Sand's literary career really begins in May of 1832 with her novel Indiana, a first success, and which was soon followed by another novel, Valentine. Both were on the same subject, the destiny of unhappily married women. And this theme was an essential element of her success. She would be regarded as an advocate of feminism. By calling on her own experience as a married woman, she took the first steps to expressing her own identity, earlier scandals notwithstanding.
Women are brought up like saints, then are dispatched like fillies.
George Sand would soon embark on a series of literary adventures and stormy love affairs.
She was going through a period of melancholy, which is reflected in her novel Lélia. During that time, George Sand was also famous for dressing in male attire, particularly for circulating with greater ease when she attended the theater. It was also at this particular time that she confirmed her talent as a writer. By changing her literary genre, Lélia is not like Indiana, the chronicle of an unhappily married woman. It is, on the contrary, a lyrical, almost erotic novel. Through the dialogue between Lélia and Poucherie, George Sand reveals her sexual relationship with Marie Dorval, a great actress of that era. The still existent letters written by George Sand to Marie are very explicit about the nature of their relationship. In one of them, she writes, "Remember that I want you." In another, she writes, "Until this evening in your dressing room or in your bed."
George Sand invents a new style of literature and draws her inspiration from her own life. Her life is also about discovery and travel. With Musset, for example.
I fell asleep again until we reached Venice, and was hardly surprised to be riding in a gondola and seeing the lights of Piazza San Marco reflected in the water like a mirage. Venice was truly the city of my dreams.
Sand causes even a greater scandal when she begins an affair with a notorious poet.
Unless one is a genius, one cannot dream of writing poetry during these voluptuous Venetian nights. One can only love or sleep.
Even when George Sand is ill, she is constantly fascinated by Italy, which is more present in her works than Barrie is. She and Musset select the prestigious Danelli Hotel for a romantic honeymoon.
This honeymoon turned into a nightmare. George Sand stayed on at the Danieli to write Leone Leoni, her first novel, in Venice. She quarreled with Musset because their publisher was demanding the books he had been contracted to write, but he had no desire to write. He wanted to have a good time. In fact, they were having such a good time that they would come back to the hotel quite ill. Then Musset became jealous of the young doctor, Pietro Pagello, and there were terrible scenes. Musset returned to France. This was a difficult time for George Sand, since she had no money. But she got by with the generous help of her friends. For George Sand, it was the best of times and it was the worst of times, and a great inspiration for her novels. A short time later, her passion for Musset was rekindled. And I think that her letters to him from Venice are the most beautiful love letters in the world.
After the luxury of the Danieli, George Sand moves to more modest lodgings in the less extravagant section of Venice. Sand always liked the simple life. With young Dr. Pagello, who is now her lover, she moves to Corte Minelli.
What hardship for those poor artists reduced to opening their windows onto these enclaves, where working day life suddenly reappears in the heart of Venice. What a hardship for those to whom silence is essential for meditation.
Her windows overlooked the canals. She loved the sight of the palazzi. She loved to watch the fish and vegetable vendors, with whom Pagello would occasionally exchange a few words in the Venetian dialect.
The gondoliers seem to express an exaggerated cordiality, which might be first interpreted as cheerful good nature, but which conceals an incisive humor and a fine wit.
Sand has a number of favorite places in Venice. One of them is the famous Café Florian.
Georges Sand would come here to the Café Florian with Pietro Pagello, the Venetian doctor. You must remember that he had been discharged by his hospital for being seen with her. She was considered a scandalous woman by most people. She also liked to come here because it made her feel free. At the time, a woman would never go to a cafe. It was very rare. Georges Sand visited all the Venetian churches because she was a great art lover. She wasn't at all fond of religion, but often came here to San Zaccaria because she loved the painting by Bellini. What she admired most was the depth and contours of the faces. Georges Sand was hungry for knowledge. She was curious about everything, without exception.
And it is also the apparent absence of class prejudice that enchants Sand about Venice. According to her, class distinction is less obvious because there are no carriages and people travel in the only available way, together by boat.
I have found what I was searching for, a profusion of art, a life of liberty, and the time to work. How could I possibly torment myself, wondering if a Mr. So-and-so has written an article on my books, or worrying that another Mr. So-and-so rants on about my dangerous principles and my immoral cigars? My 2 chicks aren't here. I enjoy it, but I'm only passing through.
Having fallen ill during Carnival, Sand gives us a most unexpected account of the celebration.
I see the masks going by. I ride in the gondolas. I keep to myself. I see no one and I work. There were splendid carnival celebrations inside the palaces and theaters. I am overcome with terrible sadness. The singing and laughter were like cries of distress to me, and with every passing gondola came the vision of a drowning man fighting against the swells of agony.
To get over the Musset episode and the harrowing carnival, George Sand can think of only one remedy: going home.
What she expected to find in Berry was the Arcadian calm of the land she knew so well, and the positive effect that it would have on her. Berry served as her own personal psychotherapy. She enjoyed the circle of friends that she had here in Le Châtre. She spent her summers swimming in the Indre River, studying astronomy and botany. But unfortunately, this ideal life of peace and harmony would soon be interrupted by her troublesome divorce with Casimir and by a most ironic twist of fate. She fell in love with her attorney, Michel de Bourges. He was also very politically active, a Republican, not at all a moderate. He leaned toward Babeuf and Robespierre. He had a very strong influence on George Sand's political convictions. But she would not play into his tendency to be a conjugal tyrant, which was often the case with left-wing politicians and Republicans of all shades of political opinion. But Michel de Bourges is particularly well known for having wanted to lock George Sand indoors one day. You can just imagine the lady's reaction.
For me, the freedom to act and think is one's most important possession. Anything imposed upon me as a duty becomes odious.
Truly free at last, Sand amuses herself by painting bucolic scenes on a fan, with her friend Charpentier. Ah, the sweet afternoons on the banks of the Indre. In summer, obviously. The nymph, disguised as a shepherdess, is George Sand, without her cigar, of course, but with a bird on her lap. The sacred bird, whose song could cure colic and foot corns, is Chopinot's, alias Chopin, called Chopinet. Beside George are the painter Delacroix and the sublime Liszt, intimate friends of hers. The man with the very large head wearing glasses is obviously the very intelligent Michel de Bourges. They had quite a sense of humor in Nohant. And frolicking among the friends are her two chicks at the river's edge, as the butterfly is George's son, Maurice, and across from him, as the wild beast, is Solange, her daughter.
We know that George Sand had a strong maternal instinct. She liked to make sure that her friends ate well. She was very attentive to their needs. We also know that she had several younger lovers who were of fragile health, and she looked after them diligently. But her behavior towards her own children was somewhat ambiguous. And that's quite a fascinating thing. Perhaps it's true that all mothers react differently towards each of their children. So the same traits that she regarded as qualities in Maurice, she considered faults in Solange. Sand's nature was passionate, disciplined, rigorous, and curious, and she hoped her children would live up to her expectations. She wanted to make exceptional people out of them. Maurice accepted this chosen path. He became a very good artist, quite talented. Her daughter Solange was a disappointment to her, almost from the very beginning. We don't know why. Perhaps because she was the child of an adulterous affair. But we don't really know. Solange was her own person, and perhaps the only person who ever stood up to George Sand. Perhaps in order to exist as herself, it was necessary for her to say no to her all-too-perfect mother.
Her friends benefit from her sense of perfection. At Nohant, each guest finds a specially prepared room. In hers, George Sand reflects and writes all through the night. Music inspires her. Maurice does a humorous sketch of her, enthralled by Liszt.
music brings me an ecstasy and rapture that are out of this world.
George Sand likes to draw pictures of herself, not only on fans, with Delacroix and Chopin, of course. That doesn't stop her from loving other sorts of music.
Je me suis appliqué à le faire propre d'un bout à l'autre, j'avais pas l'impression. Toi pareil. Hein, toi pareil.
Bon, bah, c'est une manière, il ne reste plus qu'un. 3, 4.
George
Sand contributed enormously to our knowledge of the traditional music of our region. In the 1850s, many things were changing, and she was aware that all the lute players and their repertories were about to disappear. So she would invite the musicians to her home. She raved about them in her letters, did her utmost to promote them, as others did after her. So even today, there are musical events such as the Master Players Festival for viol and bagpipe in Saint-Chartier, in the very place where her novel is set. Every year, this is the meeting ground for 140 lute players from all over Europe and hundreds of other musicians. And it's all thanks to her.
Chopin listens to these strange melodic combinations that may seem atrocious, but perhaps are magnificent.
I'm not sure what we should play on this piano, which is a piano from the period, perhaps the finale of La Funèbre.
Symbolic choice. It was composed here and was the first great piece composed here in George Sand's house.
Perhaps what might be more appropriate is the lullaby, because although the piano was purchased by George Sand, it was chosen by Pauline Viardot, and Chopin composed the lullaby in this very place, inspired by Pauline's daughter.
It's one of his masterpieces.
He composed it during his last stay at Nohant.
There's one absolutely extraordinary thing about the story of George Sand and Chopin at Nohant, and it's Chopin's productivity. Half of his music, 3/4 of his masterpieces were composed at Nohant. But whether they had a specific artistic influence on each other is questionable, I think. What she did was provide the ideal working conditions for him, the comfort and maternal care, the peace and quiet that Chopin absolutely needed. But I don't think she herself influenced his music in any way. It's interesting that George Sand dedicated La Mare au Diable to him, but there's no work of his dedicated to George Sand.
Chopin makes one instrument speak the language of infinity.
In winter of 1838, Sand takes off with her 2 chicks, and with Chopin, of course. And after the episodes of ill health for Sand and Musée in Venice, now it is Chopin who falls ill in Mallorca, always in a dream setting.
It's one of those overwhelming views that fulfill all of one's imaginations and desires. Nature has created here everything a poet or painter could dream of. I would advise those devoured by their artistic vanity to behold such sights, and behold them again and again.
Young Maurice likes to nibble on all the fruit he sees. In the orange grove, Maurice and Solange stuff themselves with oranges until they get sick. George, concerned with lodgings for her little brood, finally finds a haven for the 4 of them at the Chartreuse de Valdemosa.
They were an unmarried couple. They were living in a monastery that had been abandoned only 3 years earlier. They didn't go to church or attend Mass, so they certainly couldn't have been understood or accepted by people at that time. Moreover, Chopin's illness, diagnosed as tuberculosis by 3 doctors in Palma, only made matters worse. Word got out about his tuberculosis, and people avoided them like the plague.
As for myself, I've never felt the emptiness of words more than during the hours of contemplation spent in the Chartreuse. Some religious fervor did come over me, but only to ecstatically utter, "Dear God, blessed art thou for giving me such good eyes." I've taken my children to the cemetery around midnight several times. They gaily romped around in the moonlight. I admit that I've never gone through the cloister at night without a certain degree of fear and pleasure. A great mist would suddenly descend upon us like a shroud, penetrating the cloister and rendering us invisible. We tried in vain to avoid it, but such sinister dwellings often preyed on the imagination. Those little fantastic fears, if I may call them so, are not without attraction. Chopin, the poor great artist, was detestable when he was ill. For him, the cloister was always terrifying and full of ghosts, even when he felt well. On returning from my nocturnal ventures with my children at 10 o'clock in the evening, I would find him sitting at the piano, his eyes frantic, his hair standing on end. That's when he composed the most beautiful of his short works, modestly called the Preludes. They are masterpieces. Our stay at the Chartreuse de Valdemosa was torture for him and torment for me.
The serenity of the place did not calm her anger at the hostility of the locals.
I would like to quote from George Sand's letter to the Countess Mariani, written in Marseille on February the 26th. One more month, and Chopin and I would have died in Spain. They have wounded the most tender spot in my heart. They have stuck pins into a suffering being before my very eyes. I will never forgive them for that. And if I write about them, it will be with venom. Which is what she did in A Winter in Mallorca. But today, we Mallorcans are grateful to George Sand. Hers are, in spite of it all, the most beautiful pages ever written about our island.
Now the bitter return to the whirl of Paris social life. Sand lives in the fashionable district called the New Athens in the 9th arrondissement. It is at this time that she defines her political position.
George Sand
Georges Sand was acutely aware of social injustice because of her own origins. An aristocratic father, a poor working-class mother, practically ignorant of anything Parisian, and all her life she would side with the poor, with the oppressed, and she would strive for socialism. Socialism is the goal, the Republic is the means of achieving it, is what she was saying in 1848. Before 1848, she was still testing the ground. And then she met Pierre Leroux, who thoroughly convinced her. Why? Because of the way he presented his arguments, because his political message contained both a moral aspect, which is very important to Georges Sand, and also a cultural one. Pierre Leroux understood the power of the press. He founded two newspapers, La Revue Indépendante and L'Éclaireur de l'Indre. He set up his printing presses in the workers' cooperative at Boussa. Georges Sand financed it with her own money. She wrote for the Éclaireur de l'Indre and had two of her great political essays published in defense of Fanchette, a poor young girl who was abandoned by the nuns, then raped, probably by the police, and who became pregnant. For Sand, Fanchette was a symbol of oppression. Like the bakery workers, the poor people who worked all night long, 16 hours at a stretch, these were some of the things that completely revolted her.
Louis Viardot is very close to Georges Sand. They share many interests. One of them is music. In an illustrated letter to a friend, Musset ferociously ridicules the wedding between Viardot and Pauline Garcia, a wedding arranged by Georges Sand, who was also taken with the young singer. The crowds rushed to the Théâtre des Italiens for the return performance of Mademoiselle Pauline Garcia. Alfred de Musset and Georges Sand, together for the first time since their separation, are seated in a special box with Louis Viardot, director of the theater. At the end of the recital, Louis Viardot rushes to congratulate the young singer. More enterprising, Musset already awaits her in her dressing room. Before she bids him goodbye, she tosses him her handkerchief. Musset returns home and composes a sonnet for the diva, and then dashes to recite it at her window. Viardot learns that his nose is not particularly attractive to ladies. But believing in the seductive power of an even bigger nose, he runs to Georges Sand for help and cries in her lap. She promises to take action and save him. And so she does, by presenting a touching tribute to Louis and Pauline's love. Her eloquence wins the young lady's hand for the benefit of her friend Viardot. Pauline Viardot inspires Sand for Consuelo, a sweeping novel that takes the reader from Venice to Berlin. But in February of 1848, the revolution explodes in Paris. Louis-Philippe is deposed. Georges Sand moves to number 8 Rue du Condé in the Odéon quarter, where the secret meetings of the provisory government are held. Among the members of the provisory government are Sand's friends, Louis Blanc, François Arago, and Ledru-Rollin.
In 1848, Sand is enthusiastic. The Republic is life, she says. But what can she do at a time when women have no political rights? Her friends in the provisory government tell her, "You must write for us." And write she does. She writes nothing less than the Bulletin de la République, which is posted up all over. She launches a newspaper, La Cause du Peuple. I doubt that Sartre knew that Georges Sand had started La Cause du Peuple. She writes hundreds of pages for Gustave Thorez' La Vraie République, for the most part developing her ideas on people's rights and socialism, which was her greatest cause. She, who has both a woman's gentleness and a man's courage, is asked by certain feminists of that era to be their candidate. And she refuses. But why? Because women will inevitably have the vote someday, she says. But why not now? Because for the time being they are slaves. They have no civil status. First, the civil code must be abolished. They must have the right to get a divorce, to manage their own affairs, to become recognized individuals in society. Which is to say that women would otherwise only vote like their husbands, their brothers or their lovers, and not with their own voice as a woman. In other words, there is only one logical course, and that is to obtain civil rights first. Some people still criticize her for that today, but one must consider the times women had no rights whatsoever then.
Several months later, Parisian workers revolt against the government. The repression is fierce. Sand is horrified. She is outraged by the spilling of blood, whatever the cause.
I can't believe in any republic that begins by killing its own proletarians. Here we have a strange solution to the problem of misery. Let us learn to be patient and obstinate revolutionaries, never terrorists. I have only one passion, the idea of equality. A wonderful dream, but one that I shall never see come true. I've dedicated my life to this idea, and I know that it will be the death of me.
Ever since her youth, Sand has been spurned by the bourgeois, as well as by certain residents of La Chartre.
I've horribly shocked all the gossip mongers there, both male and female. Imbeciles. There is nothing more stupidly cruel than small-town folk, to the point that it can also be entertaining.
It was in this house that Georges Sand brought together the greatest artists of her time, musicians, painters, and writers, of course, but also political figures and philosophers. This house might be considered a veritable melting pot, a cultural center well ahead of its time. And most important, here, one had access to all artistic currents of the time. And that takes us back to Georges Sand's conception of art, which she believed to be an inherent part of society and useful for developing new ideas and a new awareness. I think she opposed Flaubert's idea of art for art's sake, or an elitist art. She, on the other hand, practiced an art of combat. Here we're in the heart of the Vallée Noire, which fired her imagination and became the setting of many of her novels. Georges Sand understood that the treatment of important universal social themes was most effective if her characters were set in a specific place. With her novels exalting the buried countryside, there was a tendency to describe her as a regional author, which wasn't the case at all. Because throughout her pastoral writings, she was addressing great political problems. This is the fortress of Sarzay. She used this setting for several scenes in her novel, The Miller of Angibault. As you see, a somewhat strange and barren landscape.
Le Meunier d'Angibault was one of Georges Sand's ideological books. It explores the problems of social class and deals with solving injustice and inequality. For someone like me, as one of today's writers, Looking at the structure of the novel, I am very impressed by her technique. She wrote very fast, but by no means simply. The intrigue is very structured. You think you know where she's going with it, but she is constantly surprising you. There is never enough said about Georges Sand's humor. Even when portraying the most unpleasant characters, she never writes with venom. Always from a distance, she understands why that character is the way he is, and she wants to help us get inside him. We always talk about how prolific Georges Sand was, but the quality of her work was equally amazing. And her eloquence should make a good number of our present-day writers green with envy.
Here we're in the forest of Saint-Chartier, which served as the setting for Les Maîtres Sonneurs.
In Les Maîtres Sonneurs, George Sand writes about the gifted local musicians that met around the great oak tree.
I think you could call Les Maîtres Sonneurs sort of Western about Berry under the old regime. It's full of fighting, horseback riding, people falling in love and then out of love and back in love again. But with all that, the driving force is music. It's almost twilight now. Perfect atmosphere for some of Georges Sand's novels. All the rustic legends that touch on sorcery, mysterious evening shadows, those particular aspects of the Berry region.
Night is a very important element in creating a certain atmosphere, and when night combines with water, the most fantastic creatures seem to appear. Such creatures were a part of her childhood, and they surfaced again in rustic legends. The famous monk of the Brise Ponds was a popular legend she heard around Saint-Chartier. Long ago, a monk and his donkey drowned in the Brise Ponds. And on certain nights, when the moon was full, the monk's half-rotting body would rise from the water, his beard crawling with leeches and frogs, and he would prey upon any late stragglers in the name of the devil. George Sand touched on all this folklore, on the popular arts and traditions, and in that sense she was a pioneer of Berry ethnography and also of French ethnography.
We've mentioned a number of novels that were set in Berry, but my favorite is the one set on the banks of the Creuse, Le Péché de Monsieur Antoine. I so love this novel because, above all, it evokes the industrialization of this region and man's exploitation of man. I find that in that respect, she was quite a visionary. She accuses man of not hesitating to change the course of nature for his own profit. She creates strong characters that have great depth.
Many of George's novels are considered shocking. To the church, Nohant is the devil's domain. No matter, a part of the house is especially designated for a particular passion that Sand, her son, and all her friends share. On the stage of the small theater, Sand tries out her own plays. Everybody takes part in the plays, friends, servants, and peasants alike.
I write the play during dessert. We learn our parts during coffee. We're in costume by 10. The play goes up at midnight. I judge my play, and if I'm not pleased, I change it completely.
But there is another stage with other actors, all created by Maurice. George finds in them, perhaps, what she has always searched for.
In our marionette theater, there wasn't what we would have called in theatrical terms a natural side. That natural side can only be an imitation of nature. It's important to return to primitive truth, to a genuine originality, to innocent emotions. I've always passionately loved winters in the country.
The love of all that is true is what she finds in Nohant or in Gargilles, with her last companion, the engraver Alexander Monceau. For Sand, to love nature is also to tame it.
This box is from one of her collections, the herbarium. This is seaweed, sent to her by her friend Malard, who was a great botanist of that era and who did much to initiate George Sand into botany. And George Sand very much enjoyed it. Look how well preserved it is. It's perfect. One of the most amazing things are these cuttings, these plant cuttings glued to a backing. And here are the little scissors she used. She always carried them with her, and this is what she used them for. I think this shows us how good she was with her hands. She was interested in anything and everything that had to do with nature. She mentioned moss time and again in her letters because she made little moss gardens for her granddaughters, and she explained nature to them. To make these famous dendrites, which she named after one of the rocks in her mineral collection, she started with paint, a paintbrush, a piece of cardboard or some stiff paper. She applied some color to the cardboard. I can't demonstrate now because all these colors have dried up since this was her paint box. She applied several colors to the cardboard. She placed another piece of cardboard on top and then pressed them firmly together so the colors would adhere to both sides. Then she quickly separated them, and she would achieve a variation of tones that looked like foliage or trees. This would inspire her to create a landscape, and in the last dendrites she always put her two granddaughters and the little dog in the picture.
Berry, land of hospitality. Sand also receives many political figures, of all parties, all except the communards, whom she will never understand. Nestled away in her country home, she continues to reign over Nohant. She loves entertaining her friend Flaubert and many others.
The bells. Those bells were there to call people with, to rally the others. A word of prime importance to George Sand, others. She knew she wasn't the only person in the world. She never imagined herself as a grandiose, solitary artist. She started writing to support her children, to keep the house going. To her, this contact with the world was no disgrace. It was life itself.
There is something of me in all things, and some of all things in me.
It
would be impossible to become like George Sand. It's impossible. It's something that can't be done. There was no model for George Sand. It's not like today when there are so many women writers that can serve as models. She really invented something that had never existed, and that something is the total woman, perhaps the first total woman in history. The beginnings were tough. It's surprising to read some of her letters to Musset and to certain friends, where she talks about putting a bullet through her head or taking poison, about how her soul was in utter darkness. It was through the act of writing that she became what she had decided to become.
On June 8, 1876, George Sand dies at Nohant, in the heart of the Vallée Noire. Always in communion with nature, she swims in the icy Indre River right up to her last day. She was the author of an abundance of works, all tremendously rich and varied. And although she may have made a few mistakes in her own life, she never made any compromises.
One doesn't praise oneself for doing good. If one does evil, it's out of ignorance. If one knew better, one would never do it again. I don't believe in evil. I believe in ignorance.